Koutou katoa, everybody. My name's Corin Dan. Thank you very much. We'll get into the panel. Sharon Zollner is on her way. When we had a little phone briefing prior to this event, she also had to leave the conference early because she was changing the rate call, the interest rate call for ANZ, which was, I think, to 3 interest rate cuts between now and sometime next year. So she's a very busy woman, but she will be here shortly. So apologies for that, but we are expecting her to arrive shortly. This is a panel really where I would encourage you to send questions through, because we get to have a bit of fun here, a bit of blue skies thinking, open it up, see where we think New Zealand could be, where it could go, what's holding us back, get a bit of the excitement factor in as to what sort of a country we think we are capable of, what are the things we're good at, what are the things we're not so good at? What are the barriers? What are those global barriers, things around investment, business confidence that are potentially holding not just New Zealand but the rest of the Western world in some ways back, how we can overcome those. So we've got a great panel today. Looking forward to their thoughts on these issues. And I want to kick it off with a little bit of an opening gambit around what we see as the advantages, the disadvantages, if you like, for New Zealand when it comes to succeeding and punching above its weight, all those sort of cliches. So I'll start perhaps with you, Sonia, from Sharesies, a great startup company. Is that how you describe yourself?
Probably a growth company now.
A growth company. You've moved to growth. Are you feeling optimistic about what can be achieved, and what do you see as the great advantages for New Zealand?
Yeah, so obviously I think it comes to, we've already got a great track record of exporting great companies from New Zealand, so such as Xero and things like that. So I'm from a small town and started my career at Xero, and I think that definitely changed my view of what was possible in starting our own business. So we definitely kind of see it, once people have paved that way, it makes it easier for other companies to follow. I think as well, things like being voted number 1 in ease of doing business. It is very easy to start and be in business here. Great supportive, connected communities. When we were starting out, there was many in this room who took the time to meet with us and help us start our business. So we're really thankful to have such a great, strong community.
Great. Scott, good place to start a business. Is it an easy place to grow a business?
For sure, Dan. I'm, as a boy from Queensland originally, who moved here 10 years ago, and a proud Kiwi now, it is a great place, and I pick up on what you said, Sharon, the connectivity is incredible. I mean, you see it over these 2 days, regulators, business, all together, all sharing, all in the one room, and you just can't do that in Australia, for starters. They're just different. Every city's a different country almost.
You don't see the population, the lack of population as a barrier?
At one point it is. That's a disadvantage that kicks in a bit later once you're up and running. But, we've seen, I think, we've had rapid growth, and at some point, we'll face a scale issue perhaps, but that's another story.
Nick Sherry, FNZ's had a fantastic growth story. What do you see as do you see barriers from your perspective?
Well, firstly, I'm a boy from Tasmania, so for me, mainland Australia, a bit like New Zealand, Australia, there are a lot of similarities between Tasmania and New Zealand in that sense. Look, FNZ's an amazing story, and I won't obviously go into the detail here, but it's now a truly global tech admin provider, having started in New Zealand, 15 years ago. Still a very substantial New Zealand base in terms of employment. Many of our global senior executives and staff, 2,000 staff around the world now, are New Zealanders, and a lot of movement, not just New Zealanders in and out of other countries, but so it's an extraordinary story. And I won't go on too much about it, except to note that it's now the fastest, largest growing fintech admin provider in the world outside the US, which is truly remarkable, having had its foundation in New Zealand. I think the greatest challenge for FNZ was the New Zealand market, which it has a very substantial shareholding of. The big challenge was the leap to go into the UK and then into Asia, and it's doing that obviously and doing it very successfully. I think it had to grow further. It had to become global, truly a global business, and that's the sort of two sides of the coin.
And is the only way to do that partner with foreign investment?
Oh, absolutely.
To go to scale?
Yes. You know, clearly FNZC, which founded FNZ, 15 years ago, then FNZ took in two PE investors to grow to the next level when it gained a major client in the UK, and very, very quickly. Our latest iteration of investment is the Quebec Pension Fund took the ownership of the PE.
Let me just pick you up on that, because often people are critical of the fact that New Zealand companies have to seek offshore funds and capital in order to grow, and see it as potentially a negative. But is it?
Well, no. Look, the inevitability.
It's necessary.
I mean, it's been referred to here already. Both New Zealand and Australia have relied for their entire European settlement period on imported capital. That's the reality. If you want to grow at a higher growth rate, you have to interconnect with global capital to grow, and global markets for that matter. So for FNZ to, aside from and I've got to pay tribute to, certainly the team, the initial very small group of people, Adrian Durham, our global CEO, who's now located in London, Charlie Trotter, our local MD, a very visionary and talented group of people who saw that to become truly a global company, you had to carry out a significant adjustment in a whole range of areas.
Ryan, or did you want to jump in there quickly?
I was just going to jump in and say, I mean, one interesting thing is...
Hello, Sharon. Welcome.
Sorry, don't mind me.
No, it wasn't. It was not your fault. The time was changed, so we're all good.
Just something interesting. Now with the FNZ story, we're seeing that technology come back to New Zealand. So we're able to benefit from, the gains that they've had, which have been paid for, I guess, by offshore companies. We're bringing that technology back here, which perhaps otherwise wouldn't have. I mean, I've been to the States, and you talk about trying to get global partners for software, and they often will say to you, well, that sounds like a very interesting idea, but if we just increase our market share in the States by 0.25%, it'll be greater than the whole New Zealand opportunity. So thanks, but no thanks.
Ryan, what's your view on where New Zealand sits in terms of those advantages and disadvantages?
Well, I mean, speaking from a point of view of a 138-year-old trustee company originally based out of Dunedin, I think from my point of view, and having just recently come to the country myself about 12 months ago, I actually think that this country is a sort of a hot pot of innovation, and from what I've seen over the period of time I've been here, I think there's so much talent out there, so many people wanting to do so much more, and I think there's actually quite a significant opportunity, particularly in financial services at the moment, around innovative ideas. And we're talking before about this concept of needing to go offshore. Yes, but the great, to me, the great thing is being able to have those ideas here first, be able to test them in an environment which is, yes, it's a smaller environment, but allows you to stand up those ideas much, much more quickly than you would otherwise. And then, yes, then having to go offshore, but then you're taking these great Kiwi concepts and great Kiwi businesses offshore, and getting the recognition of the country out there. And I don't necessarily think that it's just for the sake of seeking external capital to grow, but it's seeking a bigger marketplace to be able to grow. So revenue from other sources, because there is finite amount of customers here, So I don't know if it's necessarily just about capital raising, but more so around the ability to be able to grow into other marketplaces.
Well, that leads into questions, I suppose, about investment, and let's get into that. And there's an interesting question that's just come through on the floor, which kind of deals with some of that. It says, we only export 22% of our services because the government focuses on primary industry. If policy was changed and we could access 1% of the 180 odd billion in ACC, KiwiSaver and the New Zealand Super Fund to invest in the fastest growing sector, which is fintech, would we see companies stay longer? And that's the point, isn't it? But scale up quicker. Does anyone want to have a... Sharon, do you want to have a crack at that?
That sounds like picking winners. It's a tricky thing to do. It's got a fairly, a patchy history, I suppose. I mean, economic theory would say you should run with your comparative advantages. In New Zealand, that is water and sunshine. So I do think realistically farming will always be the backbone of this economy, and it's actually been our best productivity performer too. But it is certainly true when you get to things like fintech and services generally. Actually, productivity is much harder to measure. So we can perhaps cling on to that hope, because actually measured productivity in New Zealand's been going backwards for the last 3 years. So we better hope some of that's measurement error.
But can fintech be a tool to grow that productivity? That seems to be the argument, I think, from the Productivity Commission today, in fact, in their report. Do you see that as a vital tool for that?
Yeah, I think it's part of the mix. Fixing productivity isn't easy. Getting people across the city in a more reliable manner would probably be a good start too, and having housing that people can afford so they can actually move to where the jobs are. It's a multifaceted thing, but technology is a huge part of it, clearly.
I'll go to you, Sonia, on this, because what do you see? Would you like to see more of a shift? The government has actually highlighted, much to what Sharon was saying in David Parker's recent report, agriculture remains a big focus. Would you like to see more of a shift towards technology, fintech type stuff?
Yeah, I definitely think for anything, good ideas need money to grow, and good businesses need money to grow. I think it comes down to the theme of this conference actually about being financial well-being, and how financial inclusivity really helps kind of grow that money as well. So we see things, it's about providing more people with more opportunities. So we've seen the fund with Simplicity and Icehouse Ventures kind of contributing or choosing to put some money into high growth companies as well. So that's another way that money can be distributed or diversified across the different types of industries. So I think that's really important.
Scott, there has been a number of reports on KiwiSaver over the last couple of days, and one of them has been suggested that it should there be more flexibility. Would you like to see KiwiSaver in particular, those funds directed more into more startup style businesses? I mean, rather than be restricted to listed companies, that sort of thing?
I think it's a bit of yes is a short answer, but I think it is a kind of an issue du jour at the moment, as everyone looks around the world for some extra premium out of markets. Everything seems to be very expensive, but at Concilium we're this year actually launching an advice KiwiSaver fund, which is an open architecture wrap account, and that's quite new to New Zealand. I think within that it'll have securities and options for investment like private equity. I think products, making those available, opening up KiwiSaver, opening up the architecture is really important.
Nick, do we have the system to foster a brilliant idea that might turn up and potentially be the next Facebook, be the next whatever? Does New Zealand have the architecture, the infrastructure for that, the arteries to get the money through to grow that company? I mean, I guess we've done zero. There've been others, but can we do more of them? And is that going to happen?
Well, first, I think it will. But what are the advantages that I see New Zealand? I think they're largely, not totally, very similar to Australia. Well-educated workforce, open economy. That is interconnected with Asia, APAC. I think ironically, because New Zealand is a relatively small economy, not just to Australia but to other advanced economies, you've had to reach out to the world like Australia has, and that's been an incredibly painful process for both countries because we don't have any great trade bloc to lock ourselves in, like North America and the European Union. And I think one of the great ironies of the current Brexit debate is that and I go to the UK frequently, and lots of family there, and much of it is driven by a nostalgia. They can go back to the past, i.e. Commonwealth imperial tariffs, when New Zealand and Australia and Canada had favourable trade preference, but the world's changed. So I think one of the great advantages is that Australia and New Zealand have adjusted to the new world, the globalisation, and done it, I think, very successfully compared to other economies, and avoided a lot of the political downsides we're now seeing emerge. I mean, obviously Australia's a little bit different in terms of its economy because we've got mining, which is very substantial. But not a lot of people know education as an export is Australia's second biggest export earner. It's a substantial export earner for New Zealand. Tourism. New Zealand's got an obvious natural advantage in agriculture. And I think you've got to use your natural advantages. Do I see New Zealand as a fintech major exporter, sort of beyond its size compared to other economies? Frankly, no. Despite the fact, perhaps ironically, that I'm very familiar with the success of FNZ, it is critical that that we use these new technologies, platforms, digital, to improve productivity, keep our economy modern, and it's got an amazing number of applications and implications strategically from a business point of view. But look, fintech is a tough game. For as many successes, there's probably 9 out of 10, probably more, that don't make it. It's a very, very tough game. New Zealand, with a well-educated workforce, etc., open economy, will punch above its weight. But as a global fintech centre, I don't see it any more, frankly, than I see Australia as a global fintech centre. Australia's got a couple of interesting natural advantages, well, not natural advantages, advantages that have accrued because our superannuation sector is so large, and I'd identify fintech as being a major success growth story, and not just FNZ, but there are a number of our competitors who've done very, very well in Australia off the back of the superannuation sector. And the other interesting one I'd identify is infrastructure. Macquarie Bank and IFM are world global leaders, again off the back of our superannuation system. But realistically, I don't see Australia as a global financial centre as such. It's got a couple of advantages that I've mentioned. I think we've got to be a touch realistic about this. We're not going to be up there with London or New York or Paris. Sure. Work on our natural advantages and connect with those.
Scott, what's your view on that? Do you see, is there potential to be at least top class at what we can do and carve out a niche?
Certainly we can carve out a niche, but I think someone said we've got to play to our strengths. Be nimble, and I think identify those things that we do well. And that is the beauty of being in New Zealand, starting a firm here, that we can get to a decent scale and then look for opportunities overseas. And, we're doing the same thing in Australia and the UK. And you're kind of looking for problems that they may not, the people there that may not even know they have. So we've just got our first client in Australia, for example, and where that goes to from now, we'll just take it one step at a time. But no, certainly you can. It's sad though, someone like Xero is listed on the ASX, so we can develop these entrepreneurs, but I think the question is, how do we keep them? It would be nice if Xero was here.
Ryan, have we got the regulatory settings right to attract, and there's a question here just on that theme about to attract new players, to be able to test, come and learn, and we've certainly got the workforce, haven't we? We've got the workforce, we've got the skills.
Definitely the skills are here. I don't think the volume of resources is here. I think it's a lot of very talented people spread very thinly. I think if there's anything that I've experienced in my time in financial services, and particularly 25 years of technology as well, is I met some really great New Zealanders in technology in Australia, not and just to be able to maintain or to be able to encourage New Zealanders to stay here and for the technology to stay here. And I disagree that New Zealand can't be a hub for fintech. I wouldn't say necessarily a hub for financial services yet, but definitely a hub for fintech, because fintech is about growing small businesses, and this is the environment that encourages the growth of small businesses. I think from a regulatory point of view, we've got great regulators that are very pragmatic and actually really actively encourage innovation. And through my discussions alone with them. So I think it's a great environment to be able to create those types of fintech startups and to export. I just wish more New Zealanders would stay here, and companies like TE could get access to those types of skills. But you look at countries like Singapore, which really has virtually no natural sort of commodities, and become one of the powerhouses in Asia through shipping. And just being a place where in between other places that you can put ships through and you can assemble things and ship elsewhere. And there's no reason, in a digital world that a country like New Zealand couldn't be, a Singapore of technology, of fintech, and of data messaging and so forth. I believe the ability to be able to create those types of businesses here is significant.
I want to go to Sharon in a second for a bit of a macro overview of things, since we've got you here on stage. But I'll just quickly, Sonia, if you wanted to add to that as a growth company that's in that space, what you think needs to have more of a critical mass of companies like yours doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I would have to add the same, that just because that there is a lot of opportunity here for New Zealand to be great in all fields across technology, that we've proven ourselves to have capability in that, and that it's not necessarily having the chops in one particular industry. It's about how those when those two worlds come together, how we can use our strengths to solve any problems. And there's a lot around the investment at the moment. What we see is if there was more money coming in to help those companies grow, that we would be able to push people not just from the idea stage, but support great ideas and great entrepreneurs to become great companies. And it isn't just about picking winners, and that's not really... we don't have to see the opportunities ourselves, but we have to have the foundation for those great opportunities to find their way. And that comes with having more money to be invested, and as well having a more diverse investor base.
All right, before we dive a bit deeper into investment, I wonder if Sharon could give us an overview of what on earth is going on at the moment in the world, because a lot is made of your business confidence surveys and the grim nature of them. But that's actually a trend globally, isn't it? I mean, business confidence seems weak in the US, UK, elsewhere. People don't want to invest. And then there's this whole issue of where they find the yield and zero interest rates, negative interest rates. Where does that leave investing? What's the outlook for investment over the next few years?
Well, that's quite a question.
Yeah.
But no, I think it is true that a lot of the themes that we're seeing here and struggling to understand are actually being seen globally. So the surprisingly low business investment. In New Zealand, firms have chosen to throw labour at the problem of growing rather than taking a punt on investing. You can
so
see
will they now have to
survey.
change that? Will that lead to the change that we've been looking for?
Well, they've been saying for 3 years that finding labour is their number one problem, and they're still not investing. So, and they do seem to be pretty freaked out by the global environment at the moment. I think there is a general awareness that every 10 years or so, something nasty comes along, and we're in year 11. So, I mean, there's no rules about that sort of thing. So, but nonetheless, it is true the global environment is looking wobblier than ever, and the intersection of economics and politics has never seemed so important. Well, not for a very long time anyway, with the trade tensions and Brexit and everything else that's going on, Hong Kong protests. It's all feeling a bit fraught at the moment. So, I mean, we are an exporting nation. We've got some real things working in our favour at the moment, supporting our commodity prices. So we're actually quite shielded, but our tourism numbers are down, and I think our business sentiment
Does that raise some worries, though? Because if we've got a point where we've got good commodity returns for those core agricultural exports at the same time as we've got interest rates heading towards zero, what happens when the commodity markets aren't so good?
Yes, well, that is the problem. If you're using up all your ammunition because you need the economy to run hot, over, say 3%, because your inflation's too low, then what happens if you get a real negative shock as opposed to just a sort of persistent slowdown, which is what we've seen so far? Then you start running into the question of, do you want negative interest rates? Do you want quantitative easing, or some sort of other unconventional monetary policy? Or do you just throw your hands up and say, look, actually we're tapped out. Come on, government, your turn. So there's going to be a lot of debate over that as we go forward. My own view is that negative interest rates wouldn't be a good idea for New Zealand because of the dependence of the economy on the banking system, at least until all this fintech makes us redundant. But also banks are very reliant on domestic deposits, and so that does limit the effectiveness of super duper low interest rates. But yeah, there's going to be pressure to get creative if we get hit by any more negative shocks, because already on our forecast we've got the OCR going to just 0.25%, and we think that's about the limit of where it can usefully go.
And do you, just finally before I go back to the rest of the panel, do you worry that if interest rates going towards zero, that people chasing yield are just going to go back to assets that fire up that asset bubble further, housing, the share market, people looking for dividend stocks, these sorts of things?
Well, that is the irony. We're predicting the Reserve Bank, on the one hand, at the monetary policy statement in November, is going to cut the OCR 25 basis points. And then at the Financial Stability Review in the same month, the same guy is going to stand up and say, hey guys, you've got too much debt. So you can't have it both ways. Those trade-offs between...
Well, Adrian was telling us to spend, isn't he? He's telling people to...
Yeah, but what will he be saying that at the Financial Stability Review press conference? There he'll be saying house prices are too high and household debt's worryingly high, and everyone pull your head in. So it's a tricky one. The trade-offs are real.
All right, well, that's a good place to flick it back to you. Yeah, jump in.
Just make a quick comment. I mean, I was in politics for 22 years and I do a lot of global work, and my political economic observation is that I have never seen a greater time of uncertainty in a geopolitical sense globally. It really worries me. Obviously, the continuing tension between the US and China, certainly for Australia and New Zealand, probably at lesser so, has enormous implications, because if China takes a downturn, mining, tourism, education, exports from Australia, the impact would be really significant. Australia's more exposed to China perhaps than any other advanced economy in the world, and I've seen boom and busts in Australia and New Zealand, commodity exports, etc. We've had a great run, but it can turn very, very quickly. Europe, not just Brexit, Italy, bank debt, government debt, Germany, and the other issue that really worries me from a political perspective is the decline of the two mainstream parties of left and right in most countries, the rise of extremes of left and right. Australia and New Zealand I think, have managed these issues much more capably than others. We've had our extreme debates, but still, fortunately, I think in both cases, the alternative government is mainstream, centre-left, centre-right. But once you have the extremes of left and right becoming the alternative government, I think populism, etc., simple solutions. There are no simple solutions in the world, in my view. Simple messages, simple solutions. I think it's really worrying. To finish on low interest rates, I mean, it really worries me again, because I see it as a sign that governments are incapable of carrying out the necessary structural reform, fiscal reform, budget reform, to drive real sustainable growth, and they're relying on low interest rates to keep the world hanging together. That really worries me. And again, Australia and New Zealand, I think, have carried out these structural reforms at great pain, in great contrast to the US and Europe in particular. But that doesn't mean that we're insulated, because it's a global economy, and if things get nasty, then Australia and New Zealand are going to be hurt.
Scott, I wonder what the advice then is, or what is good advice for investors in this climate? And for those giving advice, where do you try and pick your way through that?
That's a pretty broad question. I mean, like everyone said, leave the economy to the economists, I think. But I mean, something that concerns me a little bit, that there's advisors out there today who have been in the industry for 10 years and have never lived through a downturn. That's a bit of a worry, that they haven't experienced that. The 80s taught me something, and the 90s again, and then again, the GFC. So it does feel like maybe we are due for something, but it's still, diversification is ultimately and will always remain your best friend. But that's about what I would say on that. I mean, good advice. I mean, happy to take that later, I guess. But we're passionate about independent, good advice.
Maybe Ryan, have you got any thoughts on that in terms of how investors are going to pick their way through all this minefield they're in at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to think about is other markets and building other markets. What such as fintech or technology, going out there and trying to understand. It's not the same world it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago. It's very, very different now. How do we build new markets? How do we get new confidence back into consumers to be able to invest, or the investors to be able to invest? And we were talking before about this concept of what do we do? Keeping money onshore in New Zealand. Do New Zealanders invest do KiwiSaver invest in startups and so on and so forth? I'm not saying that is the solution. I definitely don't think that is the solution. But I do think we should be more innovative in building out new capabilities, because the traditional markets that are there are slowing. So what does this country need to do? What new markets do we need to go into? We need to build a solution for the problem in business.
Sonia, what are you seeing there in that space in terms of investors, and particularly in an environment where people are looking for yield and in the share market?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to talk about advice, and especially in the times at the moment about how volatile they are, that the reality is for most Kiwis, it's no advice. It's not the difference between good advice, bad advice, it's just no advice. And so as well, we've got the less you understand about something, the more risky it's perceived. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, and everyone in this room is responsible in some way of helping with this financial literacy, and how can we turn this conversation into something that really matters to people. And then I think we can then really start to talk about what does good personalised advice look like following that.
There's a question here that's come in that's an interesting one, and it just picks up a little bit on what Sharon was saying about the banking sector and the disruptive technologies. It says here, we gave birth to EFTPOS, and 30 years on is still world leading. The US is seen as a tech home, but the banks still provide the checkbooks. Even London struggles to accept PayWave. Open banking isn't working in the UK, and the jury is still out in Oz. Do the panel think the banks will come together to play nice in New Zealand? I heard a laugh down there.
Probably not. You don't know. I mean, at the moment, with the take-up of open banking in New Zealand, I think we've only got two of the major banks that are making any assertions towards doing anything quickly. So, I see. I'm disturbed that that's actually happening so slowly. If we want to see actual innovation, and particularly we keep on talking about fintech. If we want to actually be building good advice platforms for clients. How you do that now without something like open banking as a standard? There's a bunch of Australian wrap platforms that have recently disgraced themselves by charging too much on cash. What best source of cash but people's bank accounts, and being able to access open banking without clipping tickets off cash all the time. So I really think that we need to. I mean, open banking is something that may take wealth more away from banks, but I think it's going to encourage people investing cash in banks, and wealth. Wealth needs to be distributed, and there's a bunch of very good wealth providers out there that aren't vertically aligned, and we need to be thinking about how we support those financial institutions, and how we can make financial advisors more independent.
Just quick, I was smiling or laughing because I was sort of reflecting on the fact, and I do think it's a touch unfortunate, that the big five, as I would call them, Australian, the four banks and AMP, dominate New Zealand's financial sector, and reflecting on why that's the case, particularly KiwiSaver, where I would have thought that there should be a significant homegrown Kiwi providers, So in a sense, putting a New Zealand perspective on it, it does intrigue me as to why we've ended up with 5 dominant Australian providers. I mean, I think I know why, but whether it's a good thing, of course, from a New Zealand perspective is for you to decide. On fintech, very quickly, I mean, Australia's only just moving to open banking, so it's too early to draw conclusions. I mean, my prediction longer term, and this will probably... it sort of does keep me awake a bit, adjusting to this world, is will financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, pension funds, as we understand them, nation-based regulated prudential structures exist at all in 10 or 15 years' time? May take longer. I mean, my prediction is we will see global tech platforms load global cheap products on those platforms, and they will Uber financial services. And banks and insurance companies and pension funds, as we understand them, will really struggle to survive. It'll be global product providers on global technology platforms, and if my daughters or my kids are anything to go by, they will connect straight in digitally, and you can try and regulate it, but you won't be able to. To the extent you can regulate it, it will have to be global. I think that's where the world is headed, and I think that really is a nightmare, obviously, for existing providers in the market.
Sharon, I know you don't speak for the bank as a management, you're the chief economist, but it must be something that anyone in the banking sector is thinking about, the potential for it to be disrupted from open banking, from new peer-to-peer lending, whatever you want to call it.
Yes, but I'll just point out there is a very interesting dichotomy at the moment because, as you say, more and more of this could move away from banks, and yet the regulation of banks globally and here in New Zealand is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. So they're more and more concerned than they've ever, arguably been before, that people's savings are safe. And yet what you're proposing means no one's savings are going to be safe. They're going to...
I'm not proposing it. I'm predicting this is an inevitability.
Yeah.
And look... I think these global platforms with large global asset providers will ignore country regulation. The consumer will drive this, exactly as Uber has done. It's ignored, in my view, local regulation. It's used very successfully, attempts to regulate it. The individual consumer is connected globally.
If there is one big collapse or one big story where people lose a lot of money, would that be enough to set that disruptive technology back? I mean, that's the danger if it isn't regulated, isn't it?
I mean, I don't necessarily think so, because the concept is the technology is disruptive because you're allowing access for the consumers to a greater number of asset classes and fund managers and so forth. So it's not consolidated down to individual banks, but you're actually giving a wider choice. So, to me, it's actually stabilising to a degree the way in which we seek financial advice and financial product. And I agree. I mean, you look at companies like Amazon, who came up with this great idea about distribution of books in the United States, and now we're all buying our books and consumer products through one place. And it's the same concept with financial services. It's, what's the product I want that's good for me? It doesn't necessarily have to be a New Zealand product or an Australian product or a US product, but it gives you access to different products around the world. And I think the big question is around sovereignty and regulation and how that's going to be handled, because in the end, in my opinion, consumer will win.
And I think trust plays a really important part in that, though, as well. Like, it's one thing to buy a book online versus investing your money or saving your money. So I think how this, especially without the regulation in place, so I think how trust and consumer trust is built in financial services plays a big part in in that.
So you
But
trust,
to what extent?
you trust Facebook
To what
with their
extent
currency?
to what extent do the consumers truly trust existing institutions? I mean, look at Australia and what we've been through with the Royal Commission. I mean, if you asked who they trust, I mean, there's a certain reality, because I think banks, at least in Australia, everyone loves to hate, but the reality is you have to use them because they're an essential service, effectively, a financial service. But look, I mean, I don't necessarily like this world about where we're headed, but my prediction is this is where we're going to be in 10 or 15 years' time. And look, you know, what is fundamental about existing financial institutions? I mean, any more than we believe blacksmiths were fundamental to society 100 years ago. We're going to see enormous disruption in areas that it's just touching. The legal profession, accounting, you know, all these services. This is the next wave of disruption, massive disruption, in the same way we've seen massive disruption in the manufacturing sector.
Scott, do you have something down on that? Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, there's definitely this tidal wave that's going to come, and we've got to ride it or be wiped out. We've got to surf it, you know. And, you know, we could all be disintermediated, blindsided by some black swan innovation, I guess. But, you know, I think it's going to enhance, in some ways, advice. It's going to democratise advice. You know, you only look at the airlines and the technology advancements they've made there and how, you know, 30, 40 years ago, air travel was just the thing of the wealthy. And now everyone can fly. So, you know, they may go Jetstar and someone else goes Air New Zealand. So I think the technology is going to, A, lower the costs, but it's, B, going to require those giving advice, and like people in this room, one way or another, to actually couple that with the human element. I mean, that's where, if we can maintain those relationships with our clients and give them a better experience, give them the Air New Zealand business class experience, we'll do okay with the tidal wave.
Sharon, let's bring it back to New Zealand's little place in the world. We've got a lot of things going for us, but if the politics, as you say, is intersecting with economics and protectionism rears its ugly, well, it is already rearing its ugly head, how vulnerable is New Zealand to those trends?
Well, with what's going on at the moment between US and China, we're not directly affected very much at all. A little bit of our timber exports, a bit of our wool perhaps has been caught up insofar as their inputs into China's production that's been disrupted into the US. But generally speaking, our products are out of the crossfire. So the main concern for us is the impact on Chinese employment and then the ability of their consumers to spend. But more generally, I think we are in a long-term pickle when our two best friends are not getting along so well. That puts you in a difficult spot. So our most important military strategic partner on one hand and our most important economic partner on the other. The proportion of our goods exports going to China has gone from 5% to 27% in a decade. So I suspect that's the highest concentration risk since we sold 70% of our exports to the UK in 1972.
And then there's the double effect that Australia is our second largest trading partner and
they sell
also
35% of their
to
exports to China. Yeah.
All right.
Just so we don't get too pessimistic, because I probably have been. I think one of the wonderful stories is not just China and India in terms of growth in APAC, but you look at Southeast Asia, the extraordinary story of Vietnam, their growth, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. Frankly, FNZ identifies equally, if not greater opportunities from our business point of view in countries like that. It's not just a China-India story. The growth, I mean, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, etc., they are going to be, in 20 years, they're going to be the France, Germanys and Italys of the world. And it's great for countries like New Zealand and Australia to be interconnected, having good relationships. So it's not, as I say, it's not just India and China. There are some fantastic other opportunities that we're well connected with. we have good relationships with. We know they exist. I mean, half my colleagues and friends in Europe, particularly the UK, think Asia's one homogeneous sort of economic community. They don't understand this, let alone are engaging in this. So I think that's the real upside for countries like Australia and New Zealand. At least we understand that and
do we have, Sonia, do you think a company like yours, can you export that service to a country like Vietnam? Is that doable?
Yeah, definitely. I think the typical Kiwi exporting route tends to go with the English-speaking countries through like Australia and the UK and the US. But there's so many great organisations set up now to help support Kiwi businesses go through Asia. So there's the Asia New Zealand Foundation, which has quite a long lens on building Kiwis' relationships with Asia. So I was lucky enough myself to go with them to the Philippines. And I think it was fascinating in such a growth economy to see how much similarities there are between as a growth industry for businesses like ours.
Scott, what is success going to look like for New Zealand? What do you think?
It's a big question. Success, well, I think success really for New Zealand should be, especially in light of this conference, is that New Zealand gets its financial house in order. That we see a population who's got increasing financial security, reducing poverty, increasing financial literacy, certainly. And I guess on a personal level, I mean, Concilium's vision is that we see a world where everyone has access to professional advice to enhance their financial security and their well-being. So I think that would be success.
Ryan, what do you think?
I think there's a few things. I think number one, investment in infrastructure, most definitely. I think getting Kiwis to stay in New Zealand, a sign of success, as well as growth in capital markets and getting successful businesses to stay here.
Nick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the start, I'm a Tasmanian, and I used to worry a lot about Tasmanian people leaving to go to the mainland, and my kids I know want to do that, or at least one of them's very clearly said that for new opportunities. But I think the point for Tasmania now, and I think this is true of New Zealand, a lot of them come back. I mean, in FNZ, we've got this extraordinary movement of New Zealanders in and out of New Zealand, going to other countries but they are coming back. And the other highlight for me with FNZ, but I also think this is a great strength for both Australia and New Zealand, is we are interconnected in terms of people movement and migration. That is broadly accepted. Obviously, it's a very, very hot issue, levels of migration. I'm happy to say I'm a passionate believer that migration and growing populations is actually good for the economy. It's controversial politically, and it always will be. But the good thing is Australia and New Zealand are open economies. They're accepting of people moving in and out of their countries. Yes, we have our difficult debates about that, but we've handled a damn sight better than other countries, given what we've been going through. So from that point of view, I'm a relative great optimist about New Zealand and, my home country of Australia, and a lot more optimistic about my home state of Tasmania in the last 10 years or so.
Sonia, what does success look like for you?
I have to say financial inclusion and equity for everyone. And I think, a lot of that is to do with how do we make sure everyone is involved in the economy. Like it's easy, we kind of consider this panel's about New Zealand's place in the world, but you can't kind of talk about prosperity without talking about people and how we're putting them at the heart of what we do. We talk about disruption and how people who's going to disrupt who and things like that. But really, if you focus on your customer and make sure you're solving their real needs and their real problems, that's kind of what you have to do to make sure you should deserve to exist as well, is by solving real customer problems. I think talent-wise, I love living in New Zealand, and I think it's a primo place to start a business. And I think with connectivity, that's really possible. And I think because connectivity also means being connected to your community and being where you want to be.
Ka pai. Sharon, I'll leave the last word to you because I think we're almost out of time. it's your job to be sort of pessimistic about things, isn't it? But are you optimistic at all about how we get some success, how we navigate our way through? I gather infrastructure sounded like it was something you thought we might need to do a bit of work on.
Well, my job is to be right.
Yes.
And I've been right about being pessimistic
Well,
about the
that's
economy
true.
in the last
That is
18
true.
months. And I hope at some point to be right about the economy roaring out of it again.
You call it as you see it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, you have to. I think there are really good reasons to be optimistic. In the long term, we produce food. We still have plenty of water. We're going to come out better out of climate change than many other places, including Australia. And so I think we're backing a winning horse in the long run there. I just hope the next global recession, whatever it looks like, if liberal democracy comes out of that looking robust, I'll take that as a win, quite frankly, at this point, because it's not looking particularly inspiring at the moment. So economic cycles come and go, but liberal democracy, it would be really good to have that solidly in place on the other side.
And governments are going to have to do their bit. They're going to have to spend. That's going to be the key.
Yep, I think New Zealand does have an infrastructure deficit. The challenge is always to turn that on quickly, particularly when you've got slightly different beliefs about what transport should look like, for example. But what we did see in 2008 was that whatever was spade ready got done. And so if we did get tipped into a recession by something ugly, I imagine that pragmatic approach would again dominate.
Fingers crossed. Well, thank you very much to the panel. Sharon Zollner, Chief Economist at ANZ, Nick Sherry, Chair from FNZ, Ryan Beesmer from CEO at Trustees Executives Limited, Scott Allman and Sonia Williams from Sharesies. Thank you very much to all of you. Fantastic panel. Great stuff. Cheers.